Hi everyone, my name is Shivendra and I welcome everyone to tonight's discussion on it's time to punt the lawyers. There's been a lot of hype about this discussion, a lot of offline conversations, some online as well, a lot of peacemaking behind the scenes as well. But before I progress further, to set the scene, I invite Matthew Mackey, National Manager, Cost and Commercial from Arcadis, for opening remarks. And just for everyone's information, Matt chaired the panel last month in the hard conversation where we looked at the culture, addressing some culture tensions in the construction industry. So Matt, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Shiv. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, as Shiv pointed out, I was the moderator on the last panel where we were talking about industry culture. It was certainly an exciting panel to participate in. There was lots of discussion, lots of debate, and out of that discussion actually came the idea for this next webinar, the time to punt the lawyers. Although, as you're quoting Shakespeare, he did suggest something else, and that was maybe we should get rid of lawyers from the construction contract process. Maybe they're not helping with where the industry's got to today in terms of risk allocation and collaboration. So that's really the point of the conversation today. We are asking it as a question. We're not trying to suggest that we should definitely get rid of all the lawyers, although that may be the conclusion at the end. It just really depends on how well Kiri and Owen manage to fight their respective corners. So today we've got Kiri, Parr and Owen Hefford, probably representing more so the lawyers' side. They're going to go into bat with John Davies, CEO of the Australian Contractors Association. So two lawyers and a contractor, what could possibly go wrong? So I'm going to hand the baton back to you, Shiv, and let's see where we go from here.
Yeah, I'm glad I got you to do the welcome. There's a lot of conversations around procurement practices and contracting approaches, and a lot of conversation around why many lawyers are part of the problem. And it is often suggested that the problems are caused by lawyers and the industry would be better off if it punted the lawyers. This is not something I'm saying, this is something that we hear a lot of. So our aim today is to unpack the extent to which lawyers are part of the problem and discuss how industry participants can get together, can get better contributions from the lawyers. But before I introduce the panel and get started with this discussion, there's a couple of points for you all to note. We will have about 30 minutes with the panel in terms of some questions that we have pre-prepared and received from registrants. And then we'll open up the forum for questions from the audience. During the panel discussions, you're also welcome to respond to the same questions that the panel is responding through the chat box. And we'll note your responses and compile that at the end. We may not be able to get to every comment, to every question. There's a lot of you on the call at this point in time, but your points will be noted and be used for continuing this discussion. And if you have any issues or concerns along the way, please feel free to direct message me through Zoom or message me via LinkedIn, which I've got open as well. Before I go and introduce our panel, there's a poll question for all of you to answer. So get ready to click and give your answers on this first question. Should lawyers be punted? It'll be good to hear your voice and then set the tone for this discussion. And I bet everyone is able to see the results. All right, so I think the results have stabilized. We've got 86% of the participants who have voted. Yes is 21%. No is 45%. I think that sets the tone for the discussion. And unsure is about 33%. So yeah, it'll be an interesting discussion. So I'll now move over to introducing today's panel. And I must say that all of the panels responded to our invitation with great interest and genuineness to improve the industry that we all are very proud of. So first up is the chair of the panel. So Lee Tilahun is a partner at Partners in Performance, leading their work in the capital and infrastructure space globally, and having recently joined them from McKinsey & Company, where he spent 6 years co-leading their capital excellence practice, plus helping public and private sector clients extract additional value from their capital spend. and boost productivity through digital and technology. Prior to that, he spent 17 years within the infrastructure and capital projects industry globally with organizations such as Atkins, HIDA, which is now Davies, where he led large business units of over 250 full-time employees across multiple geographies and major infrastructure programs up to $15 billion in value. I know Lee as someone who is extremely passionate and knowledgeable about the construction industry, and someone who is always in pursuit of progress. The first panelist that I'd like to introduce is John Davies. John was appointed the first Chief Executive Officer of Australian Contractors Association on 1st July 2020, after leading the Queensland Major Contractors Association for 2 years. He has over 30 years of construction industry experience supporting the successful commercial delivery of projects in Australia, the Middle East, the UK, and Asia. John is a passionate advocate for change. He's driven by a desire to ensure that every level of the industry is sustainable, resilient to boom and bust cycles, and able to deliver infrastructure society needs in a collaborative and efficient manner. The Hard Convo team continues to be grateful for the support and encouragement of ACA and John Davies all throughout. I'd like to introduce Kiri Parr now. Kiri is passionate about improving outcomes in the construction industry and operates her own consultancy practice to work with clients, industry, and its participants to do just that. Kiri is a senior fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School, lecturing in the master's course Major Projects, the Legal Interfaces, and is actively involved in the Queensland Law Society Ethics Committee and the FIDIC Contracts Committee. Prior to establishing her own company, Kiri spent more than 20 years as a construction lawyer, initially in private practice and followed by 15 years as the Regional General Counsel for Arup, a large international professional consulting company. During this time, Kiri was involved in numerous large projects in the region, including Airport Link, Gold Coast, Light Rail, and Marina Bay Sands. Kiri was on the board of Consult Australia, the industry body for consultants in the built environment, for 6 years, and was president from 2017 to 2019. From 2015 to 2019, Kiri was included in Doyle's leading in-house construction lawyers in Australia. So Kiri, thanks for joining us. And finally, we have Owen Hefford. Owen is widely recognized as one of Australia's leading infrastructure and construction lawyers. He recently founded a firm, InfraLegal, that specializes in providing strategic, legal, and commercial advice on major projects. A former partner of Clayton Utz, PwC, and DLA Piper, he has over 25 years of experience in the allocation of construction risks. Having acted for the government on some of Australia's most significant projects, Owen has drafted many of the provisions that contractors and consultants love to hate. But Owen has also drafted some of the most collaborative and innovative approaches to risk allocation that the Australian industry has seen, including alliance contracting provisions that became industry standards. Owen has become an industry champion for improved risk allocation practices. He is deeply committed to this cause, and I got to see this firsthand in the preparatory work he put in for tonight's discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Lee to commence the panel discussion and take the program from here. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you, Shiv. Hi, everyone. Look, I'm delighted to be sitting on this panel with Kiri, John, and Owen. So maybe I just kick off with a governing question and get straight into it. And what I'd love to get from you three is a yes or no answer. Or actually, if you prefer, you can say, I'd rather not say. But I think I'm just going to get straight into it and ask, should lawyers be punted? Which side of the fence are you sitting on at the moment?
Go on, I'll kick things off. And as much as it causes pain to say this, I probably think that the answer to that is no, but it's quite a sort of there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think lawyers have a very important part to play, and I don't think that we're getting enough value out of lawyers at the moment, and I guess this will come out in the conversation.
Thank you, John. Kiri?
I'm probably sitting in John's camp, but I do think we're getting the relationship wrong, and the way lawyers are trained to think and the way they see the world, it's only one lens that we should be bringing to the table, and it's in some forums it's just dominating the conversation. I'm advocating most of my time these days to re-empowering clients and owners. It's how you use that skill set and taking that control of it.
Thank you, Kiri. Owen, where are you sitting on this?
Look, I think a lot of lawyers have a lot to answer for in terms of the contracts that we draft at the moment. You know, the contracts that most construction lawyers are drafting are overly biased towards their client. They're too simplistic in terms of their binary approach to the allocation of risks, and they're much longer and more complex than they really need to be. I agree with John that, look, construction lawyers have an essential and valuable role to play in establishing suitable construction contractual arrangements, I should say, for a project. You know, the laws that apply to construction and to contracts are complex, and industry participants need the assistance of highly trained and experienced lawyers to navigate that. So I think punting the lawyers would be a mistake, in the same way that attempting to engineer a bridge without an engineer would be a mistake. But industry participants should find and seek out lawyers that understand the complexity of construction and the need to create appropriate contractual arrangements that reward and encourage the behaviour that you need between owners, designers, constructors, suppliers, subcontractors and the like to make the whole thing work.
Fantastic. I think we've probably got into some of the topics I want to talk to you about. So maybe start with a question, an open question to each of you that choose to want to answer it. So the first question really I have, or the second question is, what are the key issues and implications you see in the way contracts are drafted and applied at the moment? So feel free to, whoever wants to start on that.
I'm going to let a lawyer go first on that one.
All right. Well, I'll throw in here. I had a couple of notes on this, and one of the things I've been thinking about a lot of late, and Shiv shared a paper I wrote about collaboration. I stopped and reflected about how lawyers are trained, and I don't know if everyone appreciates that. When you think about what lawyers are taught about, they're taught from case law, and case law is when everything's gone wrong. So we have this enormous bias, that's a hindsight bias that's around failure, and things do go wrong. But if you're only trained for failure, all you see is failure and all you write for is failure, and you become very fearful of failure. So I think one of the key issues we've got is that legal lens has a failure bias. It's a hindsight bias. It's really deeply rooted in how we're trained as lawyers and how lawyers are trained to think. So for me, that's a key issue, that we're drafting contracts for failure and not success. And if you bring that as just one trigger to think about how you think about what you're trying to do with your contract and the framework and how decisions are made, that could be a good starting point. So that for me is linked to a second point, which is our contracts are drafted for dealing with issues in hindsight. And I've become an enormous advocate for how is your structure going to solve the problems that come up? What's your governance model? How are people going to come together and make decisions? And that needs information sharing. It needs the people with the authority to make decisions. It needs people willing to make decisions. So how is it going to do those things? And if you think about so many of the trends that we're seeing in our contracts, they stop information coming up. They don't share information. They remove the critical role owners have to play to make decisions. So that's a key issue I've seen. And look at the other one I see playing out. And unfortunately, I see this in the lecture room. When I see academic lawyers talking about, they start getting into really academic legal issues, and they're 3 issues down into the law and how that might affect their drafting. And it's like going, who's the audience for these contractors? We need to start drafting contracts for the people who are going to use them, the people who actually have to deliver the contract. So those are my 3 issues. Let's draft for success, not failure. Let's draft for problem solving, and let's draft for the users.
Fantastic. So I think, look, I really like those 3 points that you've given us. Maybe I just quickly go to Owen before I come to John around, what are your thoughts on building on the elements around lawyers writing the contracts, not to mitigate downside, but to really enable the upside, or getting the right balance between those two?
I mean, like I said before, I think too many contracts are overly long, overly complex, and overly biased. There's been too much adding to previous documents and not enough deleting. And I think, a good example, like the most recent PPP contract that I looked at that's in procurement down in Victoria at the moment, the legal T's and C's come to 800 pages, 800 pages of legal T's and C's. And to that, you would add the performance spec is another 650 pages again. So we're getting close to 1,500 pages. Yeah, too much adding, not enough deleting. And look, and I think this is due largely to a lack of confidence, I think, by drafters. They aren't sure what the full impact of removing words would be. And so they just leave them there just in case. And then they cherry pick from other contracts and add to it. Yeah, I think that's a real problem, and we need lawyers, that have the confidence and the ability to understand the commercial principles and draft it clearly and succinctly.
Thank you, Owen. So I come to you, John. I guess, what are your thoughts on, some interesting points made around, contracts need to be drafted to solve problems, they need to improve the upside, and also they need to be written to the right audience. And I think Owen's saying, they need to be more simplified and not increasingly made more complex and longer. I'll turn that to you, John.
Yeah, well, surprisingly, I actually agree with both of them on that one. I think it was the what used to be called the International Association of Contract and Commercial Managers. Every year they undertake a survey of the most negotiated contract terms, and they also look at which are the terms that add the most value to the client. And by and large, it's not the ones that add the value that are the most negotiated terms. It's the terms that deal with what happens when things go wrong, exactly as Kiri had said. And so we enter these things with the mindset that it's going to all turn to custard, and that's what we spend our time focusing on. But I just want to pick up on something that Owen previously said at the start. I think one of the other problems with these contracts is that we don't spend enough time at the front end trying to understand what we're all trying to get out of the process, and trying as best we can to align everyone's interests around that. And my final point that hasn't been raised would just be around the issue of uniformity of standard forms of contract. I guess it touches on what Owen said, that we keep adding to stuff. We can't help ourselves. We keep adding to stuff. We don't take away. Every time we've seen so many delivery agencies that have their so-called standard forms of contract that might have been standard the day where they were published, but then every single project that they have, they go, yeah, well, we had a bit of an issue there. Let's add something on to deal with that. And quite often the people that are adding that bit on to deal with that haven't really thought through the implications of doing so. So that causes a problem somewhere else in the contract. And then someone might think about addressing that at a later stage, and this thing just grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and to a completely indecipherable mess. I think we have to move back. We have to only tinker with standard forms of contract if there's a real pressing need to do so.
So thank you. Maybe that's a good segue to kind of pivot towards, so how is this really impacting contractors, right? So this current approach to drafting contracts, maybe I'll come back to you, John, to give us sort of a bit of a flavor from your observation from the industry in terms of how is this really impacting contractors, right? We hear that contractors are walking away from projects because of, tough commercial terms, and there's seems to be widespread issues. So you can just give us a bit of a flavor around how that is impacting the rest of the industry. What are the implications and what this really means? What is the burning platform that we're working with?
Yeah, look, I mean, sure. I mean, we've got, I was in a process, I probably can't give too much detail around this, but it was a process that was looking at trying to have a more open and transparent way of dealing with risk during a tender of a project. And the teams got together, and all of the contractors. This was even before EOI stage. The client team had prepared a list of the top 10 perceived risks that they identified, and there was an open discussion with the contractors around what they thought the risks were. And sure enough, the client came up with the usual sort of stuff, which were all direct cost risks. There were weather, ground conditions, utilities, all that sort of stuff. And then the contractors came back to them, and they were quite surprised at the things that they saw, because a lot of the things weren't direct cost risks. There were things like form of contract, who's going to administer the contract. And they said, what, you treat these as risks? You price these as risks? Yeah, absolutely, we price these as risks. So there's a direct cost impact to all of this. And the other thing is, I guess, just from what a contractor's doing here and now, because I mean that's something that they've done all of the time. But what is happening here and now is that it's deemed, currently we have all of this work coming out, so it's deemed to be a contractor's market. Supposedly it is. There's a lot of work going around, and contractors can afford to be more choosy in which projects they're going to price. So if something comes out with a Frankenstein contract, triple P or a D&C, that, like Owen says, is 800 pages long, what we are now seeing is contractors walking away. And historically, we have been our own worst enemies in terms of saying, okay, yeah, we can handle this, we'll deal with this, we'll price it. We're walking away. Contractors are now walking away.
Thank you, John. So the next question is to all of you. So aren't lawyers, I mean, we talked about it, right? But aren't lawyers just doing their job, right? Aren't they just keep trying to protect the interests of their clients, which is what they do? They pay to actually write it in a way that they're protecting the interests of the project sponsors by whom they're engaged. So I guess the question here is, what needs to change? Is it something that clients should be encouraging, setting the behaviors and sort of the expectations? So just kind of open it up to all of you to kind of give us some thoughts on who should be facilitating this change. Should it be coming from the lawyers, or should it be coming from the sponsors?
I'll have a go at that one. I think it's both. I mean, are the lawyers doing their job? Yes and no. The call on these matters is ultimately one for the client. So if the client instructs the lawyer to draft it in a particular way, well, then that's what the lawyer should do. But, the lawyer should be making sure that the client's call is a well-informed one. The lawyer should be making sure that the client's aware of the different options available and their associated benefits and disbenefits. It's also the case that many clients are very much guided by what the lawyer suggests. And so the first draft of the document that's produced by the lawyers is very persuasive. And so coming back, I think, shorter, simpler, more reasonable first drafts would make a huge difference.
Thank you.
Can I add in the thought of, I think we've ended up in a cycle where people have become fearful of the products that the lawyers are putting on the table. They don't necessarily know how to manage the legal input. And I see that playing through when you ask when do you bring the lawyer on the team to help with the contract, and it's well past the planning phase. They're often not part of the team all the way through. They basically, one or two meetings, pull the last precedent off the shelf. This is not for a large PPP, of course, or something like that, but they end up having a boxed, truncated role. it's linked to cost, it's linked to fear, it's linked to, once I have that product from them, it takes me down a path. I did a meeting a year ago and I was creating an open forum for what are the problems that we need the model to solve. And basically 15 minutes into the meeting, the lawyer had come in and told, here's the answer, and basically wanted to shut down the conversation. And that for me is a real struggle. So how we craft the design of the process and have that legal lens, just one of the voices at the table, and have them engaged in a way that they can really understand what that client's trying to achieve, what problems this contract is going to be solving. There's a more constructive way to design how you design your procurement process that can really engage everybody's issues and bring them all to the table. And sometimes I think a part of how lawyers come to market is we think that they have all the answers, and that that their job is to turn up at the table with, yeah, I've done this before and the answer will be X. And it's almost like we need to put our egos at the door and our need to be right at the door and join the team thoroughly and spend a lot more time in that problem solving space before we even start moving into that answering space.
Yeah, so let me just, before John comes in, slightly be provocative and say, are lawyers incentivized to make the contract complex because their revenue model works on the basis of them litigation on the back end? And therefore, what is their incentive in making them less required by having more collaborative contracts, which we'll talk about in a minute, and everybody's mentioning that, and therefore they're less required. So I'll just kind of throw that out to see if anybody wants to bite at it.
Go on, Owen.
I'll have a bite. Look, I think, Lee, you're assuming a sort of a one firm type approach by many lawyers. And certainly at the end of the market that I've been operating in, you specialise in either disputes or front end work. And look, a lot of the discussion thus far has been about getting better front end output out of your lawyers, and lawyers, their performance is measured individually. And so when I was at my former firms, it was about generating repeat business from my clients as opposed to generating work for the dispute end partners down the corridor. So my interests were very much around, producing contracts that my clients wanted to see and use.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, and I think something just flashed up there in the chat. Turkey's voting for Christmas, moving towards more collaborative forms of contract. I think I probably agree with Owen, although it is tempting to think of it in such simplistic terms. Coming back to the original question, I think it's a client and a lawyer issue. I think that there's not enough communication. I agree with Kiri about just as I think that it's important that contractors get brought into the procurement process far earlier. I think there is value in bringing lawyers in as well. We look at and openly, we've been having a conversation, for example, with Infrastructure New South Wales around. They came out, or the New South Wales government came out with their 10 commitments, and 3 of those commitments are largely related to contracts. Increased standardisation, more collaborative risk allocation is another thing. And we've been saying, well, look, you're not doing this. You're not doing what you say you're going to do. But to give you some let you off the hook, I suppose, a little bit. We think that the problem is because you're lacking the capability and capacity internally to deliver on it. You're outsourcing this work to external law firms, but you're either you're not properly briefing them on what it is your expectations are in terms of those things that you've committed to industry, or they are ignoring the brief and thinking, well, actually, we know better as to what it is that you're actually looking for. And then when the contract comes back, because we've got these really congested pipelines of work where they're trying to pump out all of this work, by the time that contract comes back and the contractor's reviewed it and gone, hang on a sec, we don't like this, there's a whole bunch of issues with that. It's really late in the day then, and it's a scrabble around to try and cobble something to maybe some amendments to sort of meet halfway. But I think that you've got to take it back to that early conversation and get those expectations clearly defined as to what it is you're looking for.
And
Thank you, John. Yeah, go on, Kiri.
Sorry. I think there's a big macro cycle that's going on as well. So what I've seen come through over the last 10 to 15 years is this rise in the large and the mega projects. They were almost unheard of 20 years ago, and our pipeline's now full of them. They carry much smaller profit lines and much greater risks. And the risks of these mega projects have been sitting in our companies for a very long time. And what do I think is one of the consequences for contractors dealing with these major projects? They've commercialized, they've toughened up their commercial arms, they've learned how to fight, they've learned how to scrabble over every dollar. That has fed back into how do lawyers respond to, oh, we're having more fights, we've got all this risk emerging, let's write a larger contract, and we've sold us that myth. And that myth is really translating into the engineering companies now as well, the professional consultants, because they're having to commercialize because the pressure is just moving to them. So we've created a cycle where we're getting really good at these commercial fights, and we're holding ourselves in these fights because we're all trying to preserve sustainable businesses. So unpacking that and rechanging the direction of the whole industry is going to be really, really hard work. We have to re-profitize the industry. We need to do everything we can to stop going down this dispute pathways. We need to find a way to turn the dial down on these commercial drivers that are sitting inside, that are really hardwired into the businesses now, really hardwired.
Thank you, Kiri. Maybe I'll come to you for the next question. I think before I do, I'm conscious that there's a lot of conversation happening in the chat. It's quite lively at the moment. I'm sorry not referring to them because they're probably coming in thick and fast. So what I'll probably do is just ask Shiv to kind of just summarize some of the questions we want to touch on at the end of the questions I had. So we'll make sure that the audience their questions get addressed by the panel. So we just ask the team in the background to kind of help me with that. So I think just coming back to you, Kiri. So maybe let's pivot. We've kind of talked about the problem quite a bit and sort of framed what the situation is. So just kind of being solution-minded and looking ahead. So collaborative contracting is obviously the obvious one. And we've talked quite a bit about it. And also there's a lot of conversation about it on the chat. It's not a new model, right? So contracting models have been out there for quite a while. NEC4 is one of the new models that have come out, right? So the question is, maybe it's a two-part question. The first part is, why are these being applied on projects effectively in Australia, right? So what are the barriers stopping collaborative contracting really taking root? Look, clients have realized these contracting models are not stopping projects from going wrong, right? Projects are still overrunning, they're overspending, nobody wins. It's a zero-sum game. So, this tool is out there. So why is it not applied? And the second part of the question is, you recently suggested in a separate online forum that departure tables are a poor tool for negotiating contracts. So maybe I'll ask you to say a little bit more about that point that you've made, and then come back to the, why collaborative contracting is not working.
Yeah, and let me unpack a few thoughts that's thrown up for me. So I'll start with, I don't think any one contract is a panacea or has the magic bullet. Collaborative contracts is just one of the emerging tools. And I think, we as lawyers have to accept that not everything's a nail and not everything needs a hammer. And, a wide plethora of tools is to our advantage. The piece on collaboration that I've been writing, and this is something I've been unpacking, which is, and sorry, there's been a comment come through in the chat, which is, how do you hold people to account if you don't have a contract or in a collaborative model? And to me, we're asking, it comes from the wrong question, because what you as a client need to do is bring resources into your project to solve your problem and get that project up and delivered. So how do you take somebody else's company and leverage their resources into yours to solve your problems? It's the owner who needs the project, not the contractor. Now, if you tell the contractor that they're a slave and if they step out of line, you'll whip them, and if anything goes slightest wrong, you're going to sue them, they're not going to be a very willing participant in your deals, are they? They're going to do the contract. They're going to protect themselves. They'll defend themselves. But at the end of the day, where will their discretionary effort go? Are they going to look after you as the client? Are you going to get the A team? Are you going to be the most attractive client in the market? How will they respond when something happens? And it might be the typical adversarial kind of relationship we're all talking about. What we're trying to do, I think, with the collaborative models is find a way to actually get people to work together to solve the problems. And that means I need to find a way that there's actually a financial reward for the parties to be in there. You've got to make it attractive as an economic concept for that party to work with you and for them to be there and to throw that their non-contractual resources at your problem. And if all there is a stick, they're not going to be there. So for me, it's just another tool, especially when you know you've got a more complex scenario. And why would I, as a business owner, want to work in a collaborative model? My people want to work in that collaborative model. We you know, if you've came through collaborative models through the 2000s, our people liked working in them. They were happy. And I think we need to pay attention to the human factor in our contract models.
Thank you, Kiri. Maybe given sort of the level of interest in this topic, I will ask John and Owen to sort of give some thoughts around why collaborative contracting is not working properly in Australia. Just build on what Kiri's been talking about. And also there's been some discussion in the chat about, you know, does collaboration take away accountability? So maybe some thoughts on those if you want to share.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. So why hasn't it been embraced as much as the broader sector would like? I think fixed price, you know, this, you give me the scope that I ask for, you deliver that scope and you manage all the risks for that. And in return, I'll pay you a fixed price. It's a very simplistic binary arrangement being applied to a very complex situation. But, you know, it's simple, it's very easy for the procurer to put in place, and owners can and do achieve outstanding value for money by and great commercial terms at the time they sign these contracts by running it through a competitive process. You know, and it's not very often that you'll see the Auditor General criticising a government agency for procuring goods and services in that way. And look, and I think that's sort of fixed price, fixed scope arrangement can work well if you've got one contract covering all the works needed to complete the project, and your contractor is in a position to deliver all of those works without the assistance of third parties. But the problem is construction contracts, particularly big ones, are way more complex than that. It might be that, you know, well, that contract is just one of a number of contracts that the owner is procuring to complete the project. And in that scenario, the owner is going to be wanting each of the contractors to cooperate and coordinate and interface their works around each other. Yet the owner has signed them all up to a fixed price, where each contractor is there to make a profit. And the way they make a profit is deliver the bare minimum that's required of them and minimise their costs in order to maximise their profit. And so every dollar as a contractor that you spend cooperating and coordinating with the others, it's coming off your profit. You only do it if you need to in order to deliver your scope on time and to budget. There's no incentive for you to do anything more that might make it easier or cheaper for the owner or some other participant to do what they need to do and deliver a better whole of project outcome. So, that's the basic problem with this simplistic tool that we have in terms of a fixed price, fixed scope contract being applied to complex projects. And even in that scenario that I mentioned where you got one contractor doing all of the work, as soon as the contractor starts putting in place subcontract arrangements under a fixed price, here's your scope arrangement, you have exactly the same dynamic, that all of these different participants are incentivized just to do their scope on time, etc., and for everybody else to spend the money doing the cooperating and collaborating. So there's an exercise that we need to do in better informing those who are making the procurement decisions that, hey, yeah, look, you can go to market and say, here's your scope, get a competition going, get a great price, get them to underprice risks that you've lumped into this contract because they're all desperate to win the job, and take their chances of getting variations or otherwise managing the arrangement. And so you can get a great result at contractual close, but over the longer term on these big projects, it's not going to, chances are that the owner is going to want these different participants to cooperate and to collaborate in order to achieve the better whole of project outcomes. And that tool that they've put in place just is a real obstacle to incentivizing that sort of behaviour.
Thank you, Owen. So maybe I'll go to John. Curious in terms of how you think about this. What are your thoughts around why collaborative? There's an interesting point that was made on the chat that said, Australia used to be a leader in collaborative contracting at the back end of the previous century. What's happened since then, and why hasn't it worked? And maybe give us sort of the contractor's perspective in terms of what needs to be true to make collaborative contracting more effective.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I guess the simple thing to start with is collaboration is not a form of contract. We can collaborate in any form of contract. We've seen too often we interpret collaborative forms of contract to mean alliance. Collaborative contract equals alliance. Collaborative contracting doesn't equal alliance alone. We've seen collaborative contracts, as in alliances, go spectacularly wrong. We've seen lump sum hard dollar jobs go really, really well because of collaboration, and not because of the contract, quite often in spite of contract. Collaboration, we need to move away from this. Contracts for sure can assist with collaboration and promote collaboration, but they are not in itself collaboration. And we've also got to move away from some of the things that Owen was really touching on there. Best value does not always, in fact, in most instances, does not equal lowest cost. We've got to come up with a better way of defining value and arriving and driving and incentivizing that value. To pick up on Owen's point around the lump sum, clients have got this sort of false sense of security, which I think is starting to evaporate now with this idea that you can chuck all the risk across the fence. You can get all these eager contractors to cut each other's throats and to price that risk and take on that risk. And it's not my problem. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the picture of the four people in a boat where there's two people sat in the high end and there's two people at the other end with a big leak that are bailing like mad, and the two people at the top end of the boat are going, I'm glad that's not my problem. Well, hang on a sec, that is going to be your problem very, very soon. And that's what we're seeing with risk. What we're seeing is there's one risk that clients cannot transfer, no matter what contract that they have. And that one risk is reputational risk. So when all of these other things that they can transfer come to pass, and the contractor finds themselves in a complete and utter world of hurt because they priced a whole lot of stuff that they shouldn't have tried to price, and they got it all horribly wrong. And then they're all going, well, what do we do now? Well, we've got to try to stem those losses. We've got to try and mitigate those losses. We might have maxed out on our LDs. So don't worry about hurrying here. Let's just try and cut our costs. And then you look at Sydney Light Rail or Kingston Smith Drive up here in Brisbane, where something similar happened in both of those instances. And in both of those instances, you've got the shopkeepers and the other stakeholders. They're going, hang on a sec, you said we were told here that our trade was only going to be disrupted by 6 months. It's now been disrupted by 18 months. Whose door do you think they go knocking on to complain about that? It ain't the contractor's door that they go knocking on, it's the client's door. And then what happens? The client goes back to the contractor and says, you know, that 800-page contract that Owen developed for us, forget about that. What do we need to do to make the pain go away? And they negotiate an outcome despite what they agreed to up front. So why do we put ourselves through that pain? Why do we not set ourselves up for success and deal with these issues that truly neither party can properly assess? Why don't we set ourselves up to deal with them collaboratively and incentivize all the parties to deal with these collaboratively when they come along?
Thank you, John. So I want to go back to and maybe also give opportunity for Kiri to respond to this. So I really like the point you made around collaboration is not written into the contract, right? So it's a way of working, it's the spirit of partnership. But my sense is that, but you can write collaboration out of a contract in the way you write it. So if you make it super punitive, you can actually make sure that it doesn't happen. So maybe it's just a point back to the legal minds on the panel is, what role would lawyers play, or what advice would you give clients so that, enable collaboration and the contract is drafted in a way that it does that, or at least it doesn't do the opposite. And the client sets the right behaviors within the contracting parties so that sort of collaborative approach flourishes.
You want to go first, Kiri?
Yeah, sure. Well, that whole conversation made me reflect on Alison Myram's comment the last month, where she talked about IQ, EQ, and DQ. And maybe when we're talking about collaboration, we're calling about bringing back that decency quotient, because I think we have some dreadful behaviours that sit behind that corporate front and that commercial norms that we have in our behaviour. So maybe collaboration is the return of DQ, or sorry, I've got a Robert Careism in my head, which is no dickheads policy. So we need to be honest about that. I think we need to get honest about all the lies we tell ourselves, the lies that we tell ourselves that it's a fixed price contract. We are very good at making us believe some most extraordinary things, which we know aren't true. And I was doing a piece just a week ago with a group, and they talk about, they were talking about, we have to pick up the pieces. The head honchos go into a room and do a deal, and then the rest of us have to work out how to sort out just a really wrong decision. So that's where I leave it. It's like, how do we set this up that we actually make good decisions? Because I don't think we're making good decisions.
Thank you. Owen, what advice would you give clients?
Understand what the project participants are there trying to do. They're there to make a profit, all right? They're not there to make you feel good, deliver great project outcomes, etc., etc. They're there to make money. And so what you need to do as an owner, if you want to encourage the sort of collaboration that you need from your project participants to get the cost, time, and other stakeholder engagement outcomes and whatnot that you're looking for as an owner, right, is you need to work out, right, well, what's valuable to you as an owner? What's going to add value out of this project? What's that value worth to you if you get better than business as usual performance out of your team in relation to the project? Quantify that, and agree to share some of that with your team, with the other participants, if they deliver those sorts of outcomes. And at the same time, if they don't deliver those sorts of outcomes, and it destroys value for you as the owner, well, you need to set up the commercial arrangement so that the margin, the profit that the non-owner participants generate is not the difference between the fixed price and what it costs them. It's tied directly to the outcomes that deliver value for you as the project owner. And if you can do that, then you'll get your other project participants doing what they need to do to deliver those outcomes, because that's what's going to maximise the profit for them. And then everybody's getting what they want out of the arrangement.
Thank you. Very good. So maybe I think we just pivot. There's been some useful conversations there. I've got a few more questions of my own that I've been developing as you were talking. I think before I do that, maybe just open it up again to the audience. Maybe ask Shiv to kind of point us towards one or two questions that we can engage the panel on.
Yeah, so this is a question from John, and it says large projects are typically financed under project finance model. In those circumstances, it's banks that devise risk allocation. What we've talked about clients, we've talked about lawyers. What is the role of the project financier in this? Because they are the ones who take the highest risks.
Yeah, I think related to that, there was a question around: do investors will only invest against a lump sum, or is there sort of uncertainty around more collaborative way of working, detract investors? I mean, ultimately one of the biggest investors is the government. Yeah. So it doesn't always come through the banks, but it's a fair question. Get some thoughts.
Yeah, I'll have a quick go at that because I've written about it quite a bit. So if the banks are involved, then we're talking about a project that's being privately financed as opposed to publicly funded by government from consolidated revenue. And yes, if you've got that arrangement, well, now all of a sudden there's more than two people to whom risks can be allocated or shared, if we boil it down simply. Under a traditional contract, government, contractor, two parties. Now you've got a project vehicle in the middle, right, that's raising project finance. And yes, in theory, there's some capacity now for this project vehicle to also share some risk. But the problem is project finance and the risk appetite of project financiers is very simple. They only get interest on their loan. They want the loan repaid. They don't share in any upside out of a project. And so they have a very low tolerance for risk. And they can't allow their borrower, the SPV, to take on risk that might jeopardise its ability to repay the loan. And for every piece of risk that the SPV takes on that might jeopardise its ability to repay the loan, there'll need to be more equity in the SPV to absorb that risk if things go wrong. And as you put more equity in, your cost of finance goes up because the equity is more expensive than the debt. and that all then flows through to the cost of a project, which ultimately is being funded either by government or by users through tolls if it's a user pays PPP. So yes, you know, financiers won't allow their borrower to take much risk. So that then means the risk has either got to go back to government or back down to the D&C contractor. And, you know, banks like to see their borrower offloading. They really don't mind whether it's government that takes the risk or the D&C contractor that takes the risk, so long as it's not their borrower, would be the position of the banks.
Thank you. Oh, and that's a great point. It makes a lot of sense. John, Kiri?
Yeah, look, I just agree with Owen. I mean, we do have a very interesting example on the go at the minute with North East Link in Melbourne, which is a very significantly sized project. I can't remember just how big that PPP is. It's somewhere around the $8 billion mark. And the Victorian government pulled that halfway through the procurement process. That was a fairly traditional PPP from a setup perspective, as Owen described it, with a traditional sort of lump sum D&C at the heart of it. And it's come back out now with an incentivized target cost model at the heart of it. And I don't know about Owen and Kiri, I've never seen that happen before. I think, as Owen sort of suggested, I think the only way that could have happened would be the government would have taken more equity in the project. But given at the moment, and this is probably why we're not seeing so many PPPs come to market, that there is a lot of cheap debt available out there, it would be a sensible way to go. I can't see a situation arising whereby the banks will ever really change their position on that. We've got to try to encourage, I guess, governments to take more of a stake in this to ultimately to try drive better outcomes at the end of it.
Thanks.
Yeah, and look, I don't have much to add. You know, whatever the models are that are being built to come up with the price and the checks and balances on the price and how the financial returns are going to work, they need to be really robust. And the financial systems, the people who make money out of getting projects up and running, are really incentivized to make the project stack up. And that has us collectively doing a lot of things that don't stack up in hindsight, and they shouldn't have stacked up at the time. There's an academic who just calls that the rent-seeking behaviours. These mega projects come with a lot of drivers to, you know, get a green light, and it's once they're up and running, they're very big ships, and yeah, we tell ourselves a lot of myths to get them through.
Yeah, very good. So I think that there's an interesting comment that came onto the chat that basically said, you know, that, let me just make sure I can quote it if I can find it. Otherwise, I pretty much got the gist of it, so I can speak to it. Yeah. So I think Bob or somebody said, I've come to the conclusion the two lawyers on the panel tonight are good lawyers, and I've both made quite a lot of sense tonight. The industry needs more lawyers like them. Thus, I feel the question needs to be rephrased. Is it time to punt the bad lawyers, and how? So this could be a whole different conversation, I'm sure, given we've only got half an hour left. So I'll kind of ask to see what your thoughts are on that. But I think what I would like to do is just add to that question by saying, we talked a little bit about, you know, the angle lawyers are coming at this from. It's kind of bringing back to the original question. So, and we also talked about sort of getting lawyers involved early, getting contractors involved early. Is there a way to incentivize lawyers on the, you know, the success of the contract not being how much argument has it created, more around how much argument has it avoided? And therefore, you know, what are your thoughts around, you know, one is, you know, let's punt the bad lawyers. Two is, you know, let's kind of just rethink how we measure the success of the lawyers that we hire in protecting our interests, because we've all discussed around, you know, there's no way of avoiding projects going wrong through writing contracts in a way that you think protects you. So with that thought, I'll just open it up.
I'll have a go. It's the same answer. I mean, lawyers are there to make money too, right? Make a profit. Work out what it is that you want and tie the lawyer's profit margin to those outcomes. There's no reason why lawyers can't also be engaged under the three-limb, alliance style payment model, where you reimburse their costs for whatever you want them to do, but their margin, their profit, is tied by reference to successful outcomes. So that would be my advice there. Look, I guess the other thing here too is, one of the reasons why clients, why collaborative contracting at the more collaborative end of the spectrum is not as embraced as much as it could be, is because it requires more thinking by the client, strategic thinking up front about the value. What is it that they really want? What adds value for them? And then working out how to structure a commercial framework that rewards the other participants for achieving the outcomes that you're after. But it's not rocket science. I keep hearing people say, a lot of government agencies just aren't up to, don't have the level of sophistication required to manage that sort and develop that sort of arrangement. I go, no, it's not rocket science. It just requires a bit of thought and effort. So that would be my answer. And, adopt the same sort of thinking around how you engage your lawyers.
Very good.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with that. But it brings it opens up another question, I suppose, in terms of advising clients how to go about these transactions and the use of then transaction advisors. And I've got a whole, I could talk all night about how transaction advisors or certain transaction advisors are ruining the industry with the advice that they're giving. But a simple answer to Owen's sort of, or the original question is that the clients reward. It's about repeat work. Everyone's in business to do work and to get more work. So if clients start rewarding those law firms that are aligning and are doing leading to successful outcomes by giving them repeat work and not giving repeat work to those that are ending up in bad situations, then for sure things are going to change pretty quick.
It looks like the wind is blowing away from the lawyers and towards the clients. It appears on the chats as well. So I think it's just it's a good segue to try and just drive the conversation towards sort of what are the areas and opportunities that we have. And Kiri, maybe I'll ask you to start getting us focused around, how do we tackle that? I mean, we've discussed this quite a bit, but just give us your thoughts around what are the 2-3 things you think, clients need to put in place or need to start putting in place so that we move more and more towards collaborative contracting. I think just before your answer, one thing we see is that we talked about NEC4 and other collaborative contracts that are out there, but they do get heavily edited and they kind of change and evolve from what the original to what ends up being the signed contract. So just, how do we move away from that and come back to the point that John was making around, focus on working to the spirit of partnership and not trying to protect yourself through letters on a page.
Yeah. There's this dominant legal, I call it a legal philosophy. The law, you hear lawyers go, but this is the way things are done and it's right and it's the only way to act in your client's interests. I think from tonight you're hearing that not all lawyers think that, and we don't think that the outcomes we're getting are in our client's best interests, and the stats tell us that. This conversation, I've been sort of screaming this from the roof for a while now, and I've never heard this conversation be as broad or as loud or with as many participants as I'm seeing right now. There's more of us raising our voices. I think Australia's a little bit tricky because we don't have necessarily the right structure to do this through. Australian standards could be a voice for standard contracts and this philosophy and this approach to market. I'm not quite sure if it's the right vehicle. We don't have the equivalent of ICE here, who does all of that groundbreaking work on complex systems thinking that led to NEC, that's led to Project 13. We don't have that industry structure to drive this change in this conversation. Maybe that's a gap in our market, but my message is to any owner who wants to be different, there's lawyers out there who can change the game for you.
Thank you. But there's one question just come through on innovation, and there was also a previous question that I missed from the audience around using AI and technology in, I guess, we are using historical data on performance of contracts to be able to draft better contracts. I'm not sure more contracts is the answer. It's more of, I think, it was probably where we're landing, but I thought I'll share that to see where your thoughts are around.
Yeah, it's called reference class forecasting, and you go look up a piece of software called Octant AI. It's really good.
Very good.
Someone's working down that rabbit hole already.
While we're talking about technology, I think it's an important point to raise the importance of contracts when it comes to the adoption of technology. And when we're talking about the productivity of our industry, or lack of, and the lack of adoption of technology, and you ask yourself, why is that? If you look at things like BIM, digital engineering, lean construction, all of which have been around 30 years, all of which demonstrated to lead to substantial savings, why haven't they been taken up? If they're that good, why haven't they been taken up? Well, at the heart of them, they all rely on open and transparent sharing of information. And yet our contracts are driving exactly the opposite behaviors. Yep. So we've got a real productivity opportunity here if we can change that.
Thank you. Owen? Okay.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think that our traditional simplistic binary, you deliver and take all the risk and I'll pay arrangements put in place barriers to the successful adoption of technologies like BIM. As soon as you put something in, you're not able to rely on the information put in by anybody else. And if something goes wrong as a result of your information, you'll be held to account, etc. A no blame regime coupled with a commercial framework that encourages, that stops people from blaming one another when there's a mistake in the model, and instead motivates them to overcome the issue in the way that will best achieve the KPIs and minimise pain share, is the way to go. Also, there's this concept of a shared float with critical chain project management, and under the traditional arrangement with lots of contracts and everybody with their own scope and own deadline, well, they all have their own float. There's no concept of shared float. Whereas under an alliance model, where everyone's party to the same contract, then you can create this shared float concept and derive the benefits from critical chain project management that can be generated, that you just simply cannot do under the more traditional arrangements. So there's a very strong link between rewiring our contracts to facilitate the adoption of these productivity enhancing technologies.
Thank you very much. Somebody has said to me that, what makes you think the wind is blowing away from the lawyers to the clients? Maybe I misread that. Maybe I think we're getting to the point that I think everybody has a part to play. It's not just the lawyers, I think it's the clients and possibly the contractors as well. I think with that in mind, maybe just go to John very quickly to say, we've said, Kiri kind of talked about, how progressively, confrontational the market has become. As maybe I just ask sort of again a provocative question. How have we broken the trust to a point where we are now unable to collaborate, or do you still believe that actually the fact that things have been going wrong is actually working in the favor of the industry to collaborate more?
Oh, you've saved the best to last, haven't you, Lee? I mean, that's a huge problem. I think one thing we can do is get more women into our industry. I think that would be greatly beneficial to that particular problem. But we've got to start trusting each other. We've got to look at. We have this situation now where we've got all this work to do. The governments of this country at all levels are relying on our industry to essentially take the economy forward through all of this investment that they're wanting to leverage the social and economic outcomes of that spend. We have concerns around the capability and capacity. We can't bring people in at the moment, and even when borders eventually do reopen, there'll be a huge competition for resource internationally because all governments around the world are doing the same thing. So we've got to find a way to work together. It's in our interest to find a way to work together. We have started that process through COVID. COVID has helped us enormously with that process. As an industry, as contractors, we've worked extremely closely with the unions throughout all of this to keep projects open. We've started to use this to rebuild relationships with unions and focus on the areas where we agree. Let's park the areas where we don't agree. For sure, there are a number of those. But when we think about it, there's a whole bunch of areas where we all do agree. I mean, we're having this conversation now, which was promoted as a great big bum fight, but we're all here violently agreeing with each other on the way forward. I think that we've just got to build on that opportunity that COVID has given us to collaborate and to trust each other. And sure, that's never easy, but we're never going to get a better opportunity than now to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. I want to thank the panel for having being very open, engaging, and very insightful. One comment that came in is they think that this panel should be advising government. So I would like to kind of thank you for your time and thank you for your insights. I would also like to thank the audience who've been very engaging on the chats. That's helped create a very rich conversation. With that, I will hand back to Shiv to kind of help us wrap up.
Thanks, Lee. Great discussion. Thanks to the panel. I'll officially thank you guys later on, but there's some exciting stuff to come. I'm going to put a question on for everyone. Does the industry need lawyers to draft contracts, or should the industry form an entity that drafts contracts? So let's see what the results are. And there's a couple of more poll questions to come through just to get a feel of what we take away from this very insightful and interesting discussion tonight. Guess the results are visible. The panel is smiling, so I'm pretty sure that's something that they kind of expected. We've got 48% people saying that industry forms an entity that drafts contracts, but closely followed by other options need to be considered. We'll move to the next poll question. This is another interesting one. So just get the tech team to put the next poll question. Are contracts incentivizing the right behavior and fulfilling their purpose? I think this was discussed through a question earlier on. I'm yet to see a number going yes. Oh, finally one. I hope it's not John, that number one.
I'm not allowed to vote, Shiv.
Cool. And I think this is it for questions. We have got another poll question after, but that's I'll come to that later on. Can I have the slide back? So 82% people said no, the contracts are not incentivizing good behavior. So it's probably the most dominant or clear-cut result we've seen tonight. So we'll get the slides back. A couple of things I wanted to cover off with everyone. Thanks very much for the question. The chat line has been active, so it's probably a good 800 plus 600 pages that Owen has said at the start. Probably that worth of questions that we've got or comments we've got to siphon through. There's a final question that's coming through on the poll, which is the start time. So a number of people reached out to me earlier on to say, look, is this going to be the start time or is there another time? So I'm just going to do it as a poll so we can carry on with the momentum. So this is just for everyone who's participating. I know some of us have been participating in this in all the events. So what's the preferred start time for this event? And we'll typically go an hour 15. That's the aim, although we book hour and a half for this. You guys are not making it easy for me based on the results I'm seeing. All right, we might have to run 2 sessions next time, Matty. A session starting at 5 and another probably at 6. Okay, we'll look through the information and see what we do. Maybe there's a state bias. It's good that we're doing it when daylight saving has finished. But thanks for your inputs. Before I thank the panel, there's another information for everyone, which is the last one. So we'll have an event next month. And the next month event is going back to how we started the very first one, which is going to be the interactive discussion. So we'll get 4 or 5 topics together, break out into small groups. So for those of you who are on the call today, you'll get the opportunity to share your thoughts in person, not through a chat line. And we'll break out into small groups so we can hear your thoughts and consolidate some information. And if John is keen, we might have a discussion on the Australian construction playbook, which there's a lot of discussion happening. We might continue on the discussion that we've had today amongst the other topics that we talked about. And we might even get some guests from the panel last month on addressing culture-related tensions. We can have discussions on that. So more information on that to follow. We need the conversation to be happening. It's great that more than 50 of us got together today to discuss this topic, and we really made progress. And it was my aim that when the industry wakes up tomorrow to start work, it has a different view about lawyers and it has a different view about contracts. And if 50 of us can walk away and have a different thought about it, I think we've achieved something tonight. But a lot more needs to be done. But we've got to all continue the momentum. So before I finish off, I'd like to sincerely thank our panel. Thanks really for putting in the hard work and coming over to discuss this topic. It wasn't an easy topic. I know there's a lot of scrutiny when you discuss things like this, and in a public forum. So I really appreciate that. Lee, John, Owen, Kiri, thanks very much. Also, thanks to Matt and Kiri for helping organize the event. I'd like to also thank Don for his support on the tech team and Megan for all the support she provides behind the scenes. We'll catch up at I can't say which time, 6 p.m. or 5 p.m. In a month's time, but I look forward to continuing the discussions. LinkedIn is always active. Please feel free to share thoughts, comments, involve us. #HardConvo is what we all are preferring to go by. So let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Here.